Good afternoon. As Jon Snow says, winter is coming. So I think it's already arrived, but it has arrived for people who are against school choice last night. But I'm Steve Goldman. I'm the director of the Center for Free Enterprise. I want to thank you for coming today, and I want to thank the Menard family for their donations that have made this possible, and all of our other donors also. And I'm really excited about today's event. We have Corey Angelis, who's going to talk about myths of school choice. But before I introduce Corey, I'm going to go through my usual spiel to convince you that you should at least consider economics or a business degree for your career. So if you're undecided on your major, you can do an economics degree through a BS, which would be taking the business classes, or you can do a BA, which would be taking the arts and sciences curriculum. And the economics classes are all here, but you can have a BA or BS, so it's a really nice option. You can easily co-major, and economics majors do really well in the job market, so you might want to consider it. At least consider a minor, and also you might want to consider a minor in entrepreneurship. It's a great area to know a little bit about. Regardless, take some classes in the business school. You'll get some really good, you'll get a good education that'll last a lifetime. So you received a survey when you entered, and we'd like for everybody here to complete it because this feedback is really important for us, helping us to develop our programming. But you must fill this out if you're supposed to receive extra credit or reading group credit or any type of credit. You probably need to fill this out and put your name on it so you can get the credit. And so just look at the form and fill it out. So education's been a really hot topic during the COVID epidemic. Parents have had to be at home with their children. They've seen how the teachers treat their children when they're at home watching their kids get taught. Parents differed on whether they wanted their children to go to school with mask or without mask. And it goes both ways. There's been debates at school boards about the curriculum and other issues such as teaching methods. And all these are really important issues. Parents are concerned on both sides of this issue. And a lot of these issues could really easily be alleviated if parents had the choice of what school to send their children to. Mask school, unmasked school, and so forth. And so today we're really fortunate to have Corey Angelis as our speaker. He's the top economist in the education policy field. He's the National Director of Research at American Federation for Children, the Executive Director of Educational Freedom Institute, an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, and a senior fellow at Reason Foundation. He was named one of the Forbes 30 Under 30 list, and his work on education policies received the Buckley Award from America's Future in 2020. I got all this noise. Corey's research primarily focuses on the effects of school choice programs on non-academic outcomes such as criminal activity, character skills, mental health, and political participation. He's authored or co-authored over 40 journal articles, book chapters, and reports on education policy, and he's co-editor of School Choice Myths, Setting the Record Straight on Education Freedom. Besides these many peer-reviewed journal articles, Corey's been published in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, New York Post, and the National Review. He's appeared on numerous news shows and was busy last night discussing the election results in Virginia, which had a major impact on school choice. And if you haven't got enough of Corey today during his talk here, you can watch him on Fox News tonight at 7:15. Kennedy will be interviewing him about what happened in Virginia in terms of school choice. And so it'd be really cool to see him there. Kennedy does really nice interviews. We're really fortunate to have Corey here today to dispel some of the myths of school choice. So Corey, thanks for coming.
Help me up here. Thank you so much. That was a kind introduction. How many of you guys have Twitter? Yeah, me too. I probably spend it way too much. If you were on Twitter last night and you followed me already, you probably noticed that I was tweeting every 2 seconds with updates of the Virginia governor's race. And part of the reason for that is because one of the main focuses of the race happened to be education policy. And one of the only times that I've seen it's been actually politically profitable for a Republican to be winning on education policy. In particular, it had a lot to do with parental rights. I'm not sure how many people were following the discussions with the Virginia gubernatorial race, but one of the biggest inflection points in the race was at the last debate. Did anybody watch the last debate for the Virginia race? Well, we're not in Virginia, so this makes sense. We're in Kentucky. But the biggest gaffe, and this will go down in election history as the biggest gaffe of one of the candidates, was when in the last debate, Terry McAuliffe, the Democrat, said, "I don't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach." It blew up. The Youngkin team turned that into a campaign ad, and it went downhill for McAuliffe from there. The polls had McAuliffe up by 5 percentage points before that. After that, leading up to the election, the polls were either neck and neck, or if you looked at the polling averages by Real Clear and 538, they actually had Youngkin up by 1 or 2 percentage points. And last night, Youngkin actually won by 2 percentage points. So this is seeming like it's going to be a bigger and bigger issue going forward, where more candidates are going to lean into the concept of school choice and for parental rights in general. Parents want to say in what's going on in their kids' educations, and I think more candidates are going to see that it could be politically advantageous for them to side with parents on homeschooling, parental rights, and school choice. So some people have their phones out and laptops. That's fine, under one condition. If you're not already, make sure you're following me. It's at DeAngelis Corey on Twitter. If you were last night, you'll probably see that I was up until like 2 a.m. just tweeting nonstop with updates on that election. So if I'm a little boring today, it's probably because I'm kind of tired. Not really. I slept until like 10 a.m. this morning, so I think we're going to be okay. So how many people here have heard of the concept of school choice? I mean, you read the flyer, right, to come here, so that's good. I will say that even though my co-edited book is called School Choice Myths, Setting the Record Straight on Education Freedom, I've changed how I started to talk about this concept of school choice towards funding students as opposed to systems, or funding students directly. There's a couple of reasons why I do that. One is because it is more transparent in what we're actually talking about when we say school choice. When you say funding students directly, it really illuminates what I'm talking about, which is the idea that the money that's meant for educating the child should follow them to wherever they're getting an education. That could be the public school that you're generally residentially assigned to, but if not, families should be able to take their children's education dollars to a charter school or a private school or some sort of homeschooling options, such as pandemic pods that we've seen over the past year and a half sprout up, micro schools, or homeschooling co-ops. And the main idea behind this is that education funding is supposed to be meant for educating children, not for propping up and protecting a particular institution. So we should fund students as opposed to systems, just like we do with just about every other industry and level of education with other programs. Just think about it. With higher education, including at the University of Louisville, has anybody heard of the Pell Grant or the GI Bill for veterans, for example? The money we could set it up in a way where it goes directly to a residentially assigned community college, regardless of your choice, but that's not how these programs work. Instead, the funding rightfully goes to the student, and they can choose the university that works best for them. They could choose the community college, and that option is and should always be on the table, but they can also choose to take that Pell Grant funding to a private religious or non-religious university of their choosing, or another state-run university. The money follows the decision of the student. We do the same thing with pre-K programs, including the federal Head Start program and other state-level, state-funded or taxpayer-funded pre-K programs, where we don't tell families that are using these programs to send their kid to a government-run, residentially assigned pre-K provider. Instead, the money rightfully goes to the families, and they can choose public, private, religious, or non-religious providers of pre-K services. All I'm arguing when I talk about school choice is that we apply the same logic to those in-between years of K-12 education and fund people as opposed to buildings. And that analogy can work in other industries as well. Everybody's heard of food stamps, for example. With food stamps, we don't tell low-income families that they must spend their food stamp dollars at a residentially assigned government-run provider of grocery services. That wouldn't make any sense. I think that would be absolutely ridiculous. Whether you're for or against food stamps funding at all, I think we can all agree that if we're going to spend the money, it should go to people as opposed to government institutions. With food stamps, you could take the money to Walmart if you want, but if not, you can take the money to Whole Foods or Trader Joe's or Harris Teeter or Safeway. Again, the money follows the decision of the family as opposed to going straight to one institution regardless of your choice. We do the same thing with Medicaid dollars. They can be used at private Catholic hospitals if you want. You don't have to use Medicaid dollars at a government-run hospital. We do the same thing with Section 8 housing vouchers. You can take the money to the provider that works best for you. Again, we should just apply the same logic to K-12 education and fund people as opposed to buildings. But that brings up an interesting point that a lot of the same people that support all of these other initiatives where the money follows the decision of the family or the person, they get all up in arms only when it comes to those in-between years of K-12 education. And why would that be? The reality is there's only one good explanation, and the main difference is one of power dynamics. Choice is the norm with higher education, pre-K, and just about every other industry in the United States, thankfully, for now. But choice threatens an entrenched special interest, particularly the teachers and superintendents unions, that would otherwise profit from receiving children's education dollars regardless of how well they do, regardless of the choice or the satisfaction levels of the family, and from what we've seen over the past year and a half, in some cases, regardless of whether the schools even open their doors for business. The way that I put it before is that COVID didn't break the government school system. In a lot of ways, it was already broken. And the past year and a half has simply shined a spotlight on the main problem with K-12 education all across America, which happens to be a massive, long-existing power imbalance between special interest teachers' unions and individual families. And the only way that will ever remedy that existing power imbalance and change the way that the system responds to the needs of families is to fund students directly and empower families to choose the education provider that works best for their kids. Only then will the system have an incentive to meet the needs and cater to the needs of families as opposed to the currently existing system where it's the opposite and the other way around. Just think about it, what's happened over the past year and a half. This happened in Kentucky and other places as well, but private schools from the get-go were fighting to reopen. This happened in Kentucky. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court when Governor Beshear had an order that all public and private schools could not meet the needs of their students with in-person services. The public school teachers unions cheered that decision and thought it was heroic and a great thing. The private schools went to court and elevated it all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States because they understood, it's not because the people in the two different sectors are better than one or the other, or more or less competent than the other. The difference was one of incentives, that one of the sectors gets your money regardless of whether they open their doors for business. The private schools knew that if they didn't provide meaningful services to their customers, well, the families were going to walk. They're going to take their children's education dollars elsewhere. The public schools did not have that incentive because Kentucky did not have meaningful school choice options. I don't think there's any charter schools on the ground in Kentucky. Before this year, there was no form of private school choice programs whatsoever. Just this year, there was a victory, though, after an override of Governor Beshear's veto, which is one of the most expansive education savings account programs in the nation here in Kentucky. In other states, for example, anybody see the viral, not a video, but the viral story of a Chicago teachers union boss that was railing against going back to work in person, but then was caught vacationing in Puerto Rico on the beach in person, which raises the question, well, if it's safe enough to go vacation in another country in person, why isn't it safe enough to go back to work in person? I mean, the answer is obvious to anybody who thinks about it for more than a second, is that, well, it's enjoyable to go to vacation in person. It's not very enjoyable to go to work in person. That's just the reality. And that's not blaming the people in the system. That's blaming the messed up set of incentives that are baked into the system itself. And again, the only way to fix that is to allow for true bottom-up accountability, to allow families to vote with their feet to the institutions that work best for them. We shouldn't trap people into an institution regardless of how well they do. And that's what we currently have for the most part in the current system. There was another case in California, in Sacramento County. The health county official ordered all public and private schools to close, but not the daycares. So the public school teachers unions were happy about that in California, but there was actually a Catholic private school in Sacramento County that rebranded itself as a daycare. It retrained all of its teachers and said, well, they're just, daycare workers right now, and, they're doing some educational stuff on the side, but it's not a school, it's a daycare, so we should be able to meet the needs of our customers now, right? Health county official wasn't very happy about that. You're just trying to get around the regulation. Well, yeah, because the regulation didn't make any sense. What, does COVID know if you're learning something that it's all of a sudden dangerous? It turns on a switch or something, and then all of a sudden you can get it? No, it didn't make any sense, and that's why the private schools had an incentive to get around that ridiculous regulation that shouldn't have been in place in the first place. And we had a lot of different, just weird examples of hypocrisy with the Chicago Teachers Union and a Berkeley Teachers Union president that railed against reopening the schools, but then sent his own kid to in-person private school. That's like double hypocrisy. One, you oppose other kids going to private school through school choice mechanisms, but then two, you oppose going back to work in person, but you're okay sending your kid to in-person childcare services or in-person schooling in a private institution. And that really clicked for a lot of parents over the past year and a half, that a lot of these things don't make sense. In so many states, at least 10 states that I lost track of them because all of this started happening so fast, is that a lot of the school districts were announcing that it wasn't safe enough to go back for in-person learning. Okay, that's your argument, fine. The science did not support that one way or the other. If anything, schools were a lot safer than just about any other type of provision, including grocery stores that were open the whole time, because they had students, younger customers. Whereas when parents were seeing all this stuff going on, so they said it wasn't safe enough to do the in-person learning, but they were opening those same public school buildings for in-person childcare services for daycare, but get this, they were charging parents double once through the property tax system, which is how we usually pay for the public school system, partially. But then they also charged parents out of pocket about, in some cases, up to $400 per student per week. It's like, but you just said these schools weren't safe enough for in-person learning. Well, why is it safe enough for in-person childcare services? And why am I having to pay twice? It's essentially a form of extortion. You already got half of my money through the tax system. Now you're making me pay out of pocket for the thing that I should have gotten all along. And I started looking deeper into this, and I started to realize that the common trend and the reason for this was because the public school employees were staying at home and receiving the same paycheck, but then they had private sector employees coming from the YMCA and elsewhere through other childcare businesses were coming into the school buildings, and so they had to get paid. So then the parents were having to pay those private sector employees, but now two people were having to do the job of one. And that's great for the employees in both systems. They were able to benefit from that, but that didn't really take into consideration the needs of the families. Again, why? Because there wasn't meaningful forms of school choice or the money following the child to give those schools real incentives to be about families as opposed to being about the employees. And thankfully, the teachers' unions have done such a bad job over the past year. They've kind of helped me in my role in expanding the case for educational freedom or school choice or having the money follow the child. And they've inadvertently overplayed their hand, inadvertently done more to advance the concept of school choice and parental rights and homeschooling than anyone could have ever imagined. According to the U.S. Census Bureau American Pulse Survey, the latest data suggests that homeschooling, not government schooling at home, but true homeschooling, not being enrolled in the public or private sector, and educating your children in the household actually tripled since pre-pandemic levels. Actually, a little bit over than tripled. The U.S. Census Bureau suggests that at least 11% of households are homeschooling at least one child. Pre-pandemic levels, that number was about 2 to 3% of the school-age population homeschooling. So it's a huge shift. And then there was a huge shift that we just found out about a few weeks ago. Anybody heard of charter schools? So charter school, Kentucky has a charter school law. Does Kentucky have any charter schools on the ground? I don't think so, because there's a funding mechanism with the law. And they're public schools on paper in every state that I've seen, but they're really more like quasi-public private entities. They can be independently operated, but they're heavily regulated by the government, they're funded by taxpayers, and so they're public in a lot of ways as well, where they have to listen to the federal education laws, for example, as well. But charter schools have more of a compelling incentive to meet the needs of families because students aren't residentially assigned to them. So they don't have these geographic monopolies that most government-run schools have, where you live here in the current system. For the most part, you live here, you got to go here. Charter schools, they have to entice customers or families and students to send their kids there. So they have a stronger incentive to meet their needs. And what we've seen over the past year is that families are already voting with their feet towards charter schools. The government-run schools, anybody want to guess how many students were lost from the public school system nationwide this past year? Any guesses? 1,000, 2,000 student enrollment loss?
100,000.
Pretty dang close. And I'm glad you said that, because my number is much higher, so it's going to be even more compelling. It's 1.5 million children have left the public school system at least over the past year. Charter schools have gained about 340,000 students in 42 states over the past year. That equates to about a 3% loss or more in the government-run school sector, and a 7% increase in the charter school sector. An interesting part is charter schools nationwide tend to get less funding on a per pupil level than the government-run schools. My latest report out of the University of Arkansas in 2020 estimated that across 18 different cities that the charter schools received about 2/3 of the funding per student relative to the public charters, the traditional public schools. And that's the winning doesn't stop there. We've had what we call the year of school choice, not just because people are voting with their feet in different areas, but because actual policies have gotten enacted, including the Education Savings Account program in Kentucky. But 19 states, 18 other than Kentucky, have enacted or expanded programs to fund students as opposed to systems, whereas in the previous legislative session, I can only think of one state that had a new private school choice program, and that was Utah. So we've gone essentially from 0 to 100 in the field of school choice. Part of it's because the teachers' unions overplayed their hand and inadvertently done more to advance the concept of educational freedom than anybody could have ever imagined. But two is that they showed us their true colors and who they prioritize. But there's a lot of other silver linings here, is that families, for all the horrible results that children got through remote learning, or whatever you want to call it, remote instruction, because there wasn't a lot of learning going on in a lot of cases, families got to see, one, that maybe the public school wasn't doing a good job just with the instructional material, whether that's math or reading or just the basics. But then other families got to see what the heck was going on in the classroom with conversations about political bias being introduced into the classroom. And so that has pushed families to make a new compelling argument for educational freedom. One, maybe the school is not meeting my kids' needs academically, but then two, families that had their kids assigned to an A-rated public school started to realize, well, maybe my school isn't as great as I thought it was because it's not aligned with the views of my family and my values. And so it's another argument for school choice, that you shouldn't be forced to send your kid to a school where you feel like they're being indoctrinated for 13 years. And that's more compelling than an argument saying that, well, your school doesn't have that great of math or reading test scores. Yeah, that's important, but it's not going to compel people to go out to the polls and change who they're voting for, and to support candidates, and to make them take a stand on parental rights one way or the other. And so we've had a huge expansion of school choice programs, and thankfully, if you look at the polls as well, families are waking up to this as well, Democrat, Republicans, independents, that there isn't any good reason to fund failing closed institutions when you can fund the student directly instead. Just like we do with about every other industry and level of education with all these other taxpayer-funded initiatives, we should apply the same logic to K-12 education. The latest Real Clear Opinion research polling on this found a 10 percentage point surge in support for school choice since April of 2020, with 64% support of Americans in the general public in April of 2020 to 74% support in June of 2021. And the biggest jumps in support were among Democrats and among families who had their kids in the public school system. And there's been a lot of battles that are pretty contentious over the past year and a half as well. We've seen the battles about the curriculum. We've seen the battles about the mask mandates and the vaccine mandates. We've seen the battles about whether we want to do remote versus in-person instruction. But I would argue all of these contentious battles are just a symptom of the larger problem. And that happens to be a one-size-fits-all government-run school system. We shouldn't force people into a system that isn't going to work for every single individual. It may be great for some students, but it might not be the best match for your student. And so all families should have an opportunity to send their kids to schools that align with their values and that best meet their needs in other ways as well. It could be based on safety. It could be based on maybe you had a bullying problem in the public school. There's actually a program in Florida that if your kid is bullied in the public school system, you can have a voucher, about $7,000 or $8,000, to take your child to a private school. That might be a better fit. And that might not have anything to do with the test scores. The test scores might have been great in the traditional public school. And the reality is, these policies that force people into a particular institution disproportionately affect the least advantaged in society. Advantaged families are already more likely to have school choice in a way. They're more likely to be able to afford a residence that happens to be assigned to the best quote-unquote public schools. Advantaged families are at least more likely to be able to afford to pay for private school tuition and fees out of pocket. Advantaged families are at least more likely to be able to afford to provide an adequate home-based education. What happened when all the schools closed in March of 2020? The advantaged families were sending their kids to micro schools, and the hip term this past year was pandemic pods, where 5 to 10 children got together in a household. The parents paid a private tutor in some cases to essentially be a mini school. It was safer because it was a smaller environment, not as many kids, and it allowed the kids to have more socialization in an in-person learning environment so they didn't lose as much in terms of math and reading and writing. But who were the families that were more likely to be able to exercise that right away? Thousands of families were doing this right away all across the country. I remember in the San Francisco Bay Area, they actually started a group on Facebook called Pandemic Pods. And within a couple of months, they had at least 40,000 people join that private group because parents were trying to figure things out. That's another lesson in spontaneous order, actually, if you're taking the capitalism versus socialism class here at the University of Louisville. You might learn a little bit about spontaneous order, that when the government doesn't provide something, private citizens will figure out a way to fix it. And right when the government wasn't providing something that had been provided all along, in March of 2020, spontaneously, families came together on social media and elsewhere to find solutions. But again, at first at least, it was more likely to be advantaged families to be able to exercise that right. But look, in Kentucky, anybody want to guess how much the public schools spend per student? If you already know this, just don't guess. But that wouldn't be a guess, you'd just be giving me the answer. But anybody have a ballpark guess? $4,000. That's a lot of money, $4,000 in the public school system per kid. And you might believe it if you listen to the teachers unions for decades. They'll keep telling you, oh, the Republicans are defunding our public schools. These are school choice will defund our already underfunded public schools. You've heard that one before, right? The reality is Kentucky public schools, if you're just looking at current expenditures, that's not the total, that's not even including the amount that we spend on buildings and capital expenses, it's about $13,000 per student per year. Building capital expenses is probably about 15% on top of that, maybe about $15,000 per student per year. A lot higher now. Those are 2018 numbers. It's a lot higher now after the federal bailout from Congress for COVID, quote-unquote COVID relief that wasn't even contingent upon your school actually opening. They're just using it for things that they always wanted anyway, mostly just putting more people and employees into the system, which is great for union bosses because that means more dues-paying members. But it's not so great for students and teachers that are already in the system. There are trade-offs. You can either spend that additional money to give teachers raises, or you can spend it to put more people into the buildings. The thing is, when you give a teacher a raise, that doesn't benefit the union boss all that much because that doesn't have the same effect on union dues as having more dues-paying members in the system. So there's these perverse incentives that are built into the system where the union bosses don't even have the same incentives that are aligned with the rank and file members, the individual teachers. So I've actually written an article on this in the Washington Examiner called School Choice Benefits Teachers Too. There have been 5 studies on the topic that find that private and charter school competition leads to statistically significant positive effects on public school teacher salaries. Why? Well, competition in the market for goods and services is obviously good for customers and families, but competition in the labor market is good for employees as well. School choice gives the employer, currently a geographic monopoly in the traditional school system, stronger incentives to allocate resources wisely, and the best way to do that is to put the money into the classroom towards the most valuable educational resource that we have in the current system, which is the teachers. You can fact check me on this. Just go to School Choice Benefits Teachers Too at the Washington Examiner. I have a table with all of the peer-reviewed studies on the subject linking school choice to higher teacher salaries in the public school system. But look, the reality is with that argument that school choice defund public schools, this is the main myth in the book, School Choice Myths. Everybody's heard it before, right? Whenever you have an argument or legislation that's introduced to have the funding follow the child, the other side, or the teachers' unions at least, will scream and say you're going to destroy the public schools and that this is going to defund the public schools. By the way, they spend $15,000 or so per student per year in the public schools. Private school tuition and fees on average in Kentucky, anybody want to guess?
10,000.
Close. Close. It's about $7,000. And if you want to fact check me on this, because go right ahead, you have your laptops out. It's Private School Review, Kentucky tuition, and you'll find it's about $6,000, $7,000. About half of what they spend in the government schools. Just imagine if that money followed the child and you funded students directly with even 2/3 of what we spend in the public schools. The public schools could keep a lot of the money and benefit on a per pupil basis and actually be financially better off. And then the families would be better off and they'd be able to afford private schools and microschools and homeschooling options as well. And that's just the average. Obviously, there's some that cost a lot more, but there's also some that cost a lot less. And having more than and having even just a couple of options is better than having no options at all. So funding students directly allows more families to have access to educational alternatives. In this way, school choice is an equalizer. And so let's get back to the main myth, though, that school choice defunds the public schools. Well, the reality is that the money doesn't belong to the schools in the first place. Education funding is meant for educating children, not for propping up and protecting a particular institution. We should fund students, not systems. No one would ever argue that Pell Grants steal money from community colleges just because you can use them at a private university. It wouldn't make any sense. No one would say that allowing families to choose their grocery store steals money from Walmart. It's not Walmart's money in the first place. It's the family's money. School choice doesn't steal money from public schools because the money doesn't belong to the public schools in the first place. It's meant for educating the child. It should follow them to wherever they're getting an education. And oh, by the way, they can still spend that money at the public schools that they want. If that residentially assigned government-run option works for you, that option should and is still on the table. Which gets to my second response to that argument. One, it's not your money in the first place. But two, and Medicaid dollars don't steal money from state-run hospitals just because you can use Medicaid dollars at Catholic private hospitals. It wouldn't make any sense for anybody to say that. But then two, why is your knee-jerk reaction to allowing families to have an option that everybody's going to leave your institution? That's a red flag. Hold up. You're telling me that you believe that families, when given the option, are going to destroy your schools because they're going to run for the hills? That's an argument for school choice, not against it. They're essentially telling on themselves. They understand that thousands of families are not happy with what they're getting in the current system. But that's not an argument to trap families in the current system. Advantaged families aren't trapped in the system. They have the means to get out. Who's stuck in the system because of these policies? It's the least advantaged in society today that wouldn't be able to afford private school tuition and fees otherwise. They shouldn't be stuck in that system any longer. And we can't wait. What's the next argument? Well, if we just try harder this time. Kentucky has increased per pupil education expenditure since 1970, after adjusting for inflation, by 258%. That's real terms, after adjusting for inflation. We've tried to spend more and more money. And look, I'm not arguing what the level of education funding should be. I'm just arguing that if we're going to spend the money, it should go to people, not buildings. So I'm not even going to get into the argument about how much is the right amount of education spending. If you try to ask the teachers unions, well, what's the magic number? 10 years ago, they might have told you $15,000, but it's always 20% more than we're spending now. It's always more. And the reality is that throwing more money at the problem is not going to fix the problem without fixing the roots of the issue. And that is, you can throw more and more money into a system, but until that system has an incentive to cater to the needs of families, nothing's going to change. They're going to continue just putting more people into the buildings as opposed to listening to what families actually need. What happens when you push back in the current system? In some cases, when parents are upset about what's going on in their classrooms, they've been labeled as domestic terrorists. Anybody hear about that with the National School Board Association? The National School Board Association sent a letter to the Biden administration essentially suggesting that some parents be labeled as domestic terrorists for pushing back at school board meetings. The National School Board Association, after getting tons of pushback and after getting at least 5 state chapters now that have pulled their funding from the National School Board Association. I think it's been Ohio, Missouri, New Hampshire, Live Free or Die State, Louisiana, and one more. They've pulled their funding in the past few weeks from the National School Board Association because they don't want to be involved in this political nonsense. Just teach the dang kids. And after that, the National School Board Association put out a letter, I think too little too late, that, well, this didn't go through the proper channels. We apologize for this. Kind of I don't accept that as a, you should have apologized right away before you started losing funding. And now more and more, I think we have a list of now 23 state school board associations have at least distanced themselves from that letter saying, no, we did not approve that, and we don't want any part of this. We don't agree with what was said in that letter. But it really just goes to show you that in the private sector, parents and families are viewed as valued customers. In the government sector, without school choice and bottom-up accountability, parents are viewed as unfairly as domestic terrorists. They're essentially just a nuisance. And so when a customer pushes back and they have no exit option, and you're a monopoly, well, your incentive is to just silence the opposition. And that's what we're seeing play out in the current system. My third response, which I hinted at earlier, to that ridiculous argument that school choice steals money from the public schools, just to reiterate, first, school choice doesn't steal money from public schools. If anything, public schools steal money from families. School choice initiatives just return the money to the hands of the rightful owners. 2, school choice doesn't steal money from public schools. If anything, public schools defund themselves by failing to meet the needs of families year after year. If you're doing a great job, you can still choose your public school and you won't lose any customers. Do better. Third, it's more of a technical point, so this might bore you, but we're in a university, so maybe you guys will be excited about the math. It's not that complicated, but for some political audiences, it might be pretty complicated, but I think you guys can figure it out. Public schools are funded based on enrollment counts all across the country. You have more students, you get a little more money. If you lose some students, you lose some money. We all knew that. But no state funding formula completely funds public schools based on the amount of students they have. What does that mean mathematically? In some states like Texas, where I grew up, the funding is about 60 or 70% is based on the amount of students you have. So mathematically, when you lose a student to your competition, you're getting to keep thousands of dollars for students you're no longer educating. We can see this in every school choice program that's played out in practice as well, where in general, even if you get a school choice program passed, you only get to have about half of the funding that would have been spent in the public schools. That's how politics works. You got to make concessions to get things done, right? But in Kentucky, for example, spend about $15,000 per kid per year. let's say the amount that would follow the child is about $7,000. Well, if you get to keep thousands of dollars for students that are no longer there, mathematically, you financially benefit on a per pupil basis. If you originally had $15,000 per student, you lose the whole student, you only lose half the funding for that student. On a per pupil basis, it's going to be higher than $15,000 per student. Just imagine if you stopped shopping at Walmart and started shopping at Trader Joe's or Safeway, and Walmart got to keep half your grocery bill each week. Be a good deal for Walmart. I would argue that public schools should be happy they get to keep any money at all for students they're no longer educating. Do private schools get to keep half of your tuition and fees after you leave? If you transfer to another college, does University of Louisville get to keep half of your tuition in perpetuity? No, they don't. Of course not. That's just how this works out in practice. And the reality is they actually financially benefit on a per pupil basis when students leave. Dang, I've gotten through one myth. There's 12 of them, and I'm not going to go through all of them. You can read the book for that. But another related argument is that, this is going to hurt the kids that are left behind in the public schools. Well, one, there are already kids being left behind in the public schools. We should allow more people to have a life. We shouldn't. It's essentially like arguing that, if the ship is sinking, that we shouldn't allow anybody to have lifeboats to get off because there's not enough lifeboats for 100% of the people. No, if the Titanic's sinking, you let people use the lifeboats. Similarly, with the school system, I would argue a lot of people are already using those lifeboats. We should use as many as we can as possible. But it's not a perfect analogy because in the current school system, and the evidence bears this out, when you start using the lifeboats, the ship stops sinking and things get better in the current system. There have been 27 studies on the topic. If you want to fact check me on this, it's called the Ed Choice 1, 2, 3s of school choice. And they just list all the studies that are on the topic. 27 of them, 25 of the 27 studies find statistically significant positive effects of school choice competition on the kids who remain in the public school system. Why? Because the public schools start to scratch their heads a little bit and say, well, if I don't want to lose as many students, maybe I should change my game. Maybe I should do a better job. So school choice is a rising tide that lifts all boats because of competitive pressures. There's another meta-analysis on the subject. If you don't like Ed Choice for whatever reason, even though they didn't write the studies themselves, they just summarized the evidence. But if you want another peer-reviewed journal article on the topic, it's a meta-analysis by the lead researchers affiliated with the University of Texas, Austin. Her last name is spelled Jabbar. And if you just Google her last name, Jabbar, I want to say, meta-analysis competition, you'll find a systematic review and meta-analysis of the evidence, pooling all the effect sizes together, and they also find a statistically significant positive effect of school choice competition on the kids who remain in the public school system. And if you don't, you're just going to reject all the evidence in front of you, I don't know what to tell you. But look, we should not crush opportunity. We should expand people's opportunity. And the best way to do that is to have the money follow the child. Next, there's a lot of other arguments, but one that might be pretty relevant today in Kentucky is that people will argue that, this sounds great and all, but this is unconstitutional because we have a separation of church and state in the United States. Everybody's heard that, right? And so their argument is that this violates somehow the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. They're arguing that because you can theoretically take the money to go to a private religious school, then that's government subsidizing a church, and that means that there is no separation of church and state. Well, are Pell Grants unconstitutional just because you can choose to take them to Notre Dame? No. Are pre-K programs unconstitutional just because you can take them to private religious providers of pre-K? No. And nobody makes that argument. Notice that. Nobody makes that argument for higher education or pre-K. Food stamps. You could theoretically use the funding to spend on food that is ultimately consumed at a religious ceremony. And the reason why all of these things are constitutional and do not violate the Establishment Clause is because the primary beneficiaries are the recipients of the funding, and then they can, after the fact, take the money to a religious or non-religious provider. With Pell Grants, the money goes to the student. You can take it to a religious Notre Dame if you want, but you can also take it to a non-religious private or University of Louisville if you want as well. Same thing with pre-K programs. You have a choice in the matter, and because parents are the direct primary beneficiaries and not the schools, it is not a problem with the Establishment Clause. We also have case law as it relates to K-12 education on this. 2002 case Zellman versus Simmons-Harris at the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in a 5-4 decision that, for the same reason, a voucher program in Ohio that allowed people to take their kids' education dollars to a private religious or non-religious school, or still in the public school if they'd like, that did not violate the Establishment Clause, again, because the parents were the primary beneficiaries. More recently, we've had the Espinoza v. Montana decision, which the takeaway from that case, another 5-4 decision from Chief Justice John Roberts, was a state need not subsidize private education, but once it decides to do so, it cannot exclude schools simply because they're religious. And some states are doing that right now. So we'll have another school choice case taken up at the Supreme Court. It's Carson v. Macon, and it has to do with the Maine town tuitioning program, which we can talk about later. That actually started in the late 1800s, if you want to talk about the history of school choice. It's been around for a long time in the U.S., but we're on solid ground with case law as well when it comes to giving families the right to choose the school that works best for their kids, whether it's public or private. So I'll open it up to questions in a second, but yeah, I just want to say thank you guys so much for having me. And look, this is the year of school choice, the year of educational freedom, or if you're really hip with the lingo by now, 2021 is the year that we fund students, not systems. And parents aren't going to stop fighting for the right to educate their children as they see fit. The teachers' unions have shown their true colors and overplayed their hand and awakened a sleeping giant, a new special interest group, parents. And we're all understanding that education funding is meant for educating children, not for propping up and protecting a government institution. Thank you.
We have 2 microphones on each aisle. If you have some questions, I saw some people shaking their heads, so you must have some questions. Go to those, but before that, next Tuesday in the SAC at 4 o'clock, we're going to screen Miss Virginia. Miss Virginia is Virginia Walden Ford, and she got school choice in the area of Washington, D.C., which had to be an act of Congress. And you'll see all the politics that Corey was talking about. It plays out in that movie. So I hope you guys can all attend. Okay, let's have some questions.
Hi, thank you for your talk. In theory, I agree with much of what you've said, but I want to run a scenario by you, just not to challenge you, but just I'm curious as to how you would respond. So my wife teaches orchestra at a Title I public school. So it's Title I, it's mostly low-income students, ethnically diverse, a lot of students from single-parent households, limited means. So let's say that Kentucky passes charter schools, and some parents decide that their students are going to be better off at the school across town. In some sense, what's going to happen is the students who are stuck at the residential public institution are the ones who are less mobile, right? So like I said, my wife teaches orchestra at this school. This school has a drama program, has an orchestra, has a band, has a choir, right? How is there a scenario in which, right, the more mobile students, the more advantaged students, actually, that was very eye-opening, right? I think there's a lot of truth to the fact that even now, it's the advantaged students that have more choice, right? It is a fact that at some point, the students that are left behind are the ones that are not going to be able to go anywhere else. And at some point, that will have an impact on funding, and what's going to go are the orchestra programs, the drama programs. There's a lot of research that even you might be aware of that shows that those kinds of programs are deeply enriching and have positive consequences for academic performance and all kinds of other beneficial outcomes or non-academic outcomes as well. So in a sense, is there a scenario in which school choice has the potential to rob disadvantaged students or less advantaged, less mobile students of those more enriching sorts of activities that public schools won't be able to provide if they lose some resources?
I would say the current system is what's robbing the students, not the other way around. We currently have a system where the money goes to the buildings as opposed to the kids. So when you asked if this would rob the less advantaged students. We're already doing that in the current system, and then we're failing them at really high rates. And my argument is, and I'm glad you pointed this out, is that we already have more advantaged families going and doing what they want anyway and escaping the schools that aren't working for their kids. I want more families to have that opportunity. And in fact, if you look at the data, we can't just speak in hypotheticals all the time. We have to look at what actually happens in practice. Nationwide, charter schools are more likely to have a higher percentage of low-income families than the traditional schools. And voucher programs as well are more likely to have lower-income families using the program than traditional public schools overall. So if you look at the data there, you can fact-check me on this if you want. The charter school data is at the National Center for Education Statistics. Just look at low-income students, charter schools, and they'll tell you the proportions in the charters versus the traditional. And if you also want to look at the average income of students using the voucher programs, you can go to EdChoice, who uses school choice. And they go over tons of different programs that are already in practice and just show the average household income using the program that are sending their kids to private schools versus the kids in the traditional schools. One data point, since you brought up the DC voucher program, DC, by the way, spends about over $30,000 per kid per year. And the kids using the voucher program over there, they only get about $10,000 or $11,000 per kid per year. It should be a lot higher than that, but it's only about a third. And the average household income of a student using that program, they come from a family with an average household income of about $27,000 per year in DC. Similarly, in Florida, they have the tax credit scholarship program with over 100,000 scholarships already awarded this past year. Average household income of families using that program, similarly, about $26,000 or $27,000 per year. So when you look at how this plays out in practice, I guess you can come up with all these crazy hypotheticals, but the reality is when these programs expand over time, we've seen the least advantaged taking advantage. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is because maybe they're the least happy with their public schools. If you're already happy with your public school, you can keep your public school. But then two, the programs tend to be targeted by disadvantaged status, whether that's by special need or by the income level of your family, or any number of reasons as to why your public school might not be working. And again, if you look at the studies on the topic, 25 of 27 find statistically significant positive effects of the school choice competition on the kids who remain in the public schools. So even if it's theoretically possible that the more advantaged, even if you don't buy my initial argument that more advantaged are in the public school system than the voucher system or the charter school system, then you can look at the data suggesting that, well, the kids who remain in the public schools, they're doing better than they would have otherwise without the competition. So I think it's a win-win situation from what we've seen in practice.
Hi, I just want to say thank you for your talk. I thought it was very, very insightful. My question's kind of about, you said this phrase about funding people instead of the institution or the building, and I'm kind of confused about how this would look in application and wanted to see what your vision was for it. I'm assuming it would be kind of like almost a voucher system, but the way that a lot of private schools operate is, their main selling point is like, oh, we have better resources, more opportunity through your school, so this is a costlier option. So in that case, would, a voucher for like a private school be worth more than a voucher for a public school? And so like, if that was the case, would that really be helping disadvantaged students if, you have to have more than one voucher to go to a private school? That might have been really multi-parted and confusing, but I guess I just kind of wanted to know more about like how this would look in application.
Yeah, the basic idea of the voucher is that the money that would have followed your child to the traditional public school, you could take it to another provider, a private school or a homeschooling option. Or with vouchers, you couldn't choose homeschooling option, but you could use it for paying for tuition at private school and fees as well. With the education savings account option, which I would say is the purest form of funding students as opposed to systems or the gold standard of school choice going forward, is that the money that would have followed your child to the public school, you could still send it all there. You can still take it all there. But if not, you can opt out, have the money follow the child to an education savings account, to which then you can use to spend at private schools for tuition and fees, but you can also use it for private tutors, textbooks, instructional materials, other types of homeschooling options, any approved education expenditure. So that's like the basic idea, but in practice, sometimes it's not the full amount that would have been spent in the public schools. So I mentioned earlier, a lot of the times it's only half of what would have been spent in the public schools. So let's say $7,000. Well, in Kentucky, that's the average private school tuition and fees in Kentucky. Well, let's say it was much higher than that. Let's say you only had $3,000 follow the child, and average private school tuition is $7,000. Well, that's just an average number. There could be private schools that cost a lot less than the $7,000, and so having one or two options is better than having zero options. But then two, and this is why I like to talk about these analogies, is because it starts to make more sense that these arguments against school choice are illogical, in that the argument that's made on the other side is that this $3,000 or so isn't going to be enough to cover the $7,000 tuition and fees. The lower income students are going to be stuck in the public schools. But the reality is the same people that make these arguments don't call to get rid of Pell Grants just because they don't cover the full cost of tuition and fees at Harvard. And the reason that everybody understands that you should still support Pell Grants even if they don't cover the full cost of tuition and fees is that every little bit helps, and I'd rather help someone 80 or 90% of the way than not help them at all. Because the alternative is that then they get 0% of the way, and then there's a lot less of a likelihood that they'll be able to afford it. A lot of private schools will report sticker prices too, and then give discounts for lower income students. So there's that plays into this as well. Same thing with food stamps. Would you be against a food stamp program just because it doesn't cover the full cost of groceries? No, and the reason for that is because we all understand that helping someone some of the way is better than helping someone none of the way. So that's main response to that. And then another piece of that is the same groups that make these arguments about this isn't enough to cover private school tuition and fees. A lot of times I'll come back and say, well, would you support fully funding the program then? Have the whole $15,000 follow the child? And then they really don't want that. Then they'll switch the argument to, well, then you're stealing more money from the public schools. Well, then don't bring this other argument up that isn't, when it's really about just how much money the public schools have. And then you're going to throw everything at the wall and see what sticks when it comes to all of these other arguments that are put forward. Thanks.
So I had a question regarding school choice. I agreed to your point that it would, like, school choice would work in a metro area, but I grew up in a suburban area, a large suburban area, north of Chicago. I don't necessarily see how school choice is a reality that would work in a suburban area, since schools are a lot more spread out, and like where I'm from, public transportation is just not a thing. So I wanted to get your perspective on, is it still practical in a suburban area? And property values are greatly tied to the quality of the school district that property is in, and like how that would affect, if you were to have school choice, what would happen to like property values, since they're greatly protected by a school district.
Yeah, I'll say one, the first question, my response is that's the worst case scenario, is that there's no change. If nobody uses the program and you just still have your current geographically assigned school, then you just stay in your school and nothing happens. Your schools don't lose any money, but then also you don't have as many options as other places in the state. But I think in reality is that families would have some more choices. There still might be private schools in the area, and even if not, this is a good reason for education savings accounts as opposed to vouchers. Vouchers can typically only be used for private brick and mortar school tuition and fees, whereas education savings accounts allow for a more robust supply side response because you don't have to use them at a brick and mortar private school. You can use the education savings accounts for microschools or homeschool co-ops or independent private tutors. And with these pandemic pods that we've seen over the past year, they just kind of met in a household. And so there's more flexibility for customization for families with education savings accounts, and more of a likelihood, at least, that there will be a robust supply side response. So I think that's why we should be pushing for ESAs as opposed to, I mean, this argument applies to rural areas as well, not just suburban areas, that Rural areas may not have a private school at all. And so it's the same argument that's put forth. And then your other question was about property values. It is true that if you introduce school choice into an area, that there could be an effect on property values. And it depends on whether you were assigned to a good school or not. If you're assigned to a good school, it's more likely to have a negative effect on your property value, because in the current market for housing, the price of your house, the quality of the school you're assigned to is reflected into the price of your house. And if that's detached, that premium on your house is likely to go away, or at least it's theoretically possible for it to go away. And on the flip side, if you're in a place that's not assigned to a great school, that should have, at least theoretically, an upward pressure on housing price. Because now you're not stuck in this school that's not working, and now you have an option to do other things.
Why did you purposefully refuse to talk about critical race theory? You're talking about how we're awakening a sleeping giant when I think the giant's been awake. You're talking about, or you're accrediting sort of this wave on, the unions are really screwing up. People are realizing that our schools are run horribly. When I was on Twitter last night too, and I saw trending woke lash, and how this is a response, it's a rejection of not anti-school choice, but a rejection of critical race theory. And you're going on Fox News tonight. I'm sure they've been giving plenty of lip service about how this is a rejection of critical race theory, not in support of school choice. The giant hasn't been sleeping. It's fear-mongering racism, which has been alive. And if you want to ride that wave for your economic stance on it, then I just request you be honest about it instead of specifically avoiding the topic.
I am honest about it. I don't take a side on critical race theory and whether it should be taught in classrooms or not. That's an argument for school choice, that if you feel like you're sending your kid to a school where that doesn't align with your values, or they're focusing on a particular topic, or maybe you're not teaching it in the right way, maybe it's politically biased in one way or another, then families should be able to take their children elsewhere. On the flip side, if you're in a public school that's super Trumpy in a rural area, for example, then you should be able to take your kids out of that school to another private school that's not that way. And so it can go both ways. It's not just one way or the other. And so I don't have a stance on the topic. I don't have a stance on whether schools should have mask mandates or not either, for example, or vaccine mandates. But I think families shouldn't be forced to send their kids and pay for their kids to go to a school that doesn't align with their preferences or values either way. And I respect all freedom of choice on both sides of the table.
I'd say include it in the main body next time then.
So I had two pretty short questions, and they're kind of personal, so you can feel free not to answer. And if you would like to elaborate on them, you can as well. So my questions were mainly based out of curiosity. Have you ever worked in the educational field, whether it's a public school or a private school, and have you attended a public school or a private school? Thank you.
Yeah, so I was educated in government-run schools all through K through 12. So that's part of my background. And then, no, I haven't been a teacher in a public school, but and I don't know the basis for this question, but some people will ask this question because they think that if you haven't been a teacher, you can't say anything about education, which I think is just absolute garbage. That you don't need to be a mechanic to be able to choose your mechanic. You don't need to be a doctor to be able to choose your doctor. You don't need to be a teacher to be able to say that you're not happy with the current system, or that you should be able to choose another school for your kid. And so I think parents are expert educators for their own kids, and they have more knowledge and information about what their kids needs than bureaucrats sitting in offices hundreds of miles away. But that might not have been the purpose of your question. Oh, am I buzzing? Or probably shouldn't have been standing on that side the whole time, but yeah, thank you for your question.
Thank you for your time and your talk today. I'm just curious, what you think is the first steps in returning the funding to the parents for an educational savings account as opposed to keep pumping funding into the public school systems?
Well,
Is it
we've already taken the steps all across the nation this past year and a half. Is that you typically have a bill go through the state legislature, and the most common form I've seen this past year has been the education savings account idea, which is something that passed here in Kentucky and several other states. Actually, this past year, the number of states with education savings accounts doubled, given that it also started from a base of 5. So we went from 5 to 10 states with education savings account programs. And we have about 31 states now that have either a voucher, tax credit scholarship, or education savings account program. But that's typically the way that it's done, is you have a bill go through the legislature, it either passes or it doesn't. If it does pass and then gets approved by the governor. In Kentucky, that did not happen. There was a veto, and then the Kentucky legislature did an override of Beshear's veto, and then it still got passed. But it depends on how your state works. Every state's a little different, but the basic process is you pass it through one chamber, pass it through another chamber, and then it goes to the governor for a signature or a veto, and then if it's vetoed, you can override it, and depending on the state that you're in, there's different amounts of votes that you need to do an override. I think in Kentucky, it's just a constitutional majority.
All right. Thank you for your time, first of all. Do you think there should be some sort of government evaluation on what kind of subjects the schools are teaching? Because especially if government money is going into those schools, say a school is trying to rewrite history or take out some of the more bad parts or write it in a biased way, do you think at some point that becomes an unethical way of giving education or teaching?
Yeah, I don't want to give that power to the government. And we've seen this in some states where they're calling to ban critical race theory. I don't think that's the best way forward. I think the better way forward is to fund the student directly and then give them a choice. So I don't want the bureaucrats to be able to say that, to be the arbiter of truth and to be the decision makers for everybody else's kids. I think parents are in the best decision to make those choices for their kids. But I would be willing to accept some form of regulation in forms of if there's obvious harm that's happening on the part of the child for these types of programs. Let's say the parent, there already are regulations for these types of things. If the parent's not spending the money on education, for example, then the government should step in and make sure that they're spending the money on education. But I get really, I'm hesitant to approve the government deciding a one-size-fits-all curriculum for everyone else. And then that could also have unintended consequences on the private schools that decide to participate in the programs too, because the more heavily you regulate these programs, the fewer and fewer private schools you'll get to be willing to accept the funding. And what does that mean? Well, it means that it's less likely to have more choices available to more students. So I want to have a thriving marketplace so that families can have as many options as possible without crossing a certain line. I'm not willing to put my foot down as to what that line looks like, but obviously I think we can all agree if there's obvious harm being done to the child or if they're not even educating the kid at all, then the government should step in.
Thank you, Corey. Thank you guys for coming. Hope to see you next Tuesday, 6 to 7.